Hi guys, I'm BK. I'm psychologist. I have a specialization in Ericksonian hypnotherapy. I have been my master's in neuropsychology in the recent months, and this presentation I think it's a way to make people know about this construct, which is psychopathy, which people it's very popular in in the media, in popular perspectives, and it has a lot of issues, even inside the scientific research. And those recent years, with the development of more brain imaging and biological studies, some things have come under a good light as in evidence for some perspectives and conceptualizations that we had in history. So I'm gonna start with the themes. One thing that I found very interesting and it is what made me enter in this kind of research on psychopathy is because it's very popular in the media. So we see, read about things about psychopaths and psychopathy, and what got me into the reading more and doing the research on my thesis on it was because there are some truths, but they are not exactly what people think. This passage is from Theophrastus. He was a disciple of Aristotle, and in the character, he wrote about the unscrupulous man. You guys can read, I will not read, but this is a passage of the ancient Greece. It is from ancient times. And what I enjoy about it most is because it is a very accurate perspective about psychopathy. And I will return to it later on the presentation, and I will make the presentation in a way that to show that this is the most accurate portrayal of psychopathy that we can have, and it's very old. It's from ancient Greece, and it's just simply amazing of how we can have some stable behavioral tendencies for people. So the history of psychopathy, it started with Pinel when he described the Manisan's delusion. I don't know if I'm talking it right, but he talked about people who had maniac episodes, maniac behaviors, but they didn't have delusions. They were perfectly sane. And those people knew they were doing criminal behaviors, they knew they are doing wrong things, but apparently they just didn't care. And next we have Picard, which came with the more insanity. So he started to make a more judgmental aspect to it. He brought the moral aspect of insanity, of being sane as in having the intellectual capabilities, but being insane as in not caring about society, about moral standards. And the first commentary about some specifics of psychopathy, as in more psychological aspects, was of Kraepelin, with the immunity to punishment and deficient effect. And he proposed it as bringing up from Pinel and Picard observations that those people, they continue to make criminal behaviors, they continue to do them, and they were apparently immune to punishment. They didn't care, it wasn't working for them to stop doing those. And apparently they had deficient affect, which changed how they related to moral stuff. The first time we got the term written was from Koch, when he coined the term psychopathy, which is an unfortunate term in a sense, and I will explain it in the next page. But he was the first one who coined the term. When he coined this term, Cleckley started studying, and the first portrayal of the psychopath was written in a psychological way. He posed several it as a construct. He proposed several behavioral tendencies that construct the psychopath. And Cleckley is very influential because of his book, The Mask of Sanity, which is a reminder of the Picard and Pinel propositions. But the first scientific scale proposition was done by Robert Hare when he did the psychopathy checklist, and it was the first measure. It is the best measure we have when we are assessing criminal behaviors, criminal psychopathy. And why I said that psychopathy is an unfortunate term is because psychopath can mean disease of the soul, which can mean any psychopathology. That's the thing. It can mean anything in a sense when you focus on psychopaths as people who have mental illnesses. But most people now understand psychopathy as a term that refers to people who do not have emotions, who are serial killers, who are criminals, and those stuff. And on this proposition of disease of the soul or something biological, emerged the sociopathy, which was a proposition by people from sociology to remind people of the influence of the environment. It didn't quite go well on the terminology. It has been declining in some aspects, but it is sensible. It is a sensible proposition the sociologists did, and I will come back to it when we start discussing the conceptions of psychopathy. And there are some relevant aspects such as acquired sociopathy or pseudo-psychopathy, which is the well-known case of Phineas Gage, which received a orbital frontal brain damage. So he had a bar damage the frontal part of his brain, and he started to change. He went from a worker and a trustworthy person to a person who didn't care about morality, who did criminal behaviors, and he acquired psychopathy. Nowadays, we have the classification systems such as the DSM, and psychopathy nor sociopathy are terms that are used. The terms used are either antisocial personality disorder or conduct disorder. Conduct disorder is more for kids or adolescents, and antisocial is for adults. They are different constructs, and they tackle specifically criminal behaviors. So behaviors that go against the law or go against the general interest of society. And there is something interesting about the classification system, because with the development of research and increase in evidence of these particular cases of what we call psychopathy, which was included in conduct disorder, the specifier of limited prosocial emotions. And it's a very, very relevant term that is related to callous and unemotional traits from biological research, which has been getting closer to psychological research. And one thing that I want to make clear, I will be talking about that, but the clarification about unsocial behaviors, criminal behaviors, and violent behaviors. And social behaviors are not necessarily criminal behaviors. And social behaviors, they just go against what is the socially accepted behaviors. So it's like speaking your mind out loud when people are silent. It's like going against. It can be unsocial behavior depending on the context. And criminal behavior is a subset of unsocial behavior that is focused on the conflict of interest with the law. So it has to have to go against the legal system. And violent behavior are an even a subset of criminal behavior, very specific to behaviors that engage in physical harm to others. So there is some kind of perspective of physical injury to others. And that's relevant because I will be saying some things, I will remind it later on, but it's very relevant because the first conceptions of psychopathy, they were related to criminal behaviors. They were on people who had been incarcerated, and most of the research is on people who have had any kind of conflict with the law, have been incarcerated, and so on. So psychopathy has some conceptions and characterizations, and they differ in their perspectives. So one thing that I will be talking about when I reach the constructs, the measures, is about primary and secondary psychopathy. The concept of primary psychopathy is something that is biological, is something that is ingrained into the person's genes. It's something that they rose to be, not because of environments, but because of their genetics and the genes environment interactions. The first one who proposed this was Clefley. He proposed the global affective deficit. He proposed that it was the main aspect of psychopathy. It was the deficits in affective issues. So he proposed that those people were not necessarily criminal. I read his book. He went on specific cases. He analyzed that he treated, and some of those cases, those people didn't even have any legal conflicts. So those people never went to jail or were in risk of going to jail. And that's very relevant because Clegley is someone that was the first person who conceptualized psychopathy, and I think he made a very, very accurate portrayal of this primary psychopathy. And Karpman was another person that he proposed this ethic affective deficits, but he also proposed the cases for acquired affective deficits, which would be affective dysfunction, which would be the sociopathy that was talked earlier. So Cartman, primary psychopaths, Milley, primary psychopaths, while the secondary psychopaths would actively be sociopaths. So they are inherently made psychopaths. Likens is another person that focuses on the aspect of fearlessness, which is a very, very specific marker for psychopathy. It has its benefits and on its perspectives, but it focuses specifically on the aspect of being fearless, of it, the dysregulation of fear aspects as the primary source of their issues, which is usually related to punishment in correctional facilities. McCord has the aspect of lovelessness and guiltlessness, and they propose that it is entirely environmental. They focus on the aspects of not having developed this kind of social emotions. Milley proposed the aspect of social emotional depths, which is specifically focused on the aspect of the social emotions. So they have deficits in social emotions in general. It is a very particular perspective. It's not globally endowed. It's something that is more on the social aspect. So they have emotions, they have them, but they do not develop those emotions, so they have these deficits. And this secondary psychopath for Milley is something that happens due to social disadvantage. They do not have the environment to learn those social emotions. And something that people talk about is about the triarchy model of psychopathy, but it is a phenotypical model. It's a model that is focused on the presentation of the behaviors. So it's not for etiology, it's not meant to have a primary characteristic or to say, oh, this is a very specific case because of this. And they focus on three constructs, which is inhibition, boldness, and meanness. Most people are, it is, in research, it's very, very recent, a very recent conceptualization of psychopathy, but it's getting track on the aspect of constructs of measures. And one thing that I put below is about the measure. When the PCLR, which is the psychopathy checklist revised, was done, it became the gold standard for diagnosing psychopaths. It was the only one in existence for a long time, and people just assumed that psychopaths were this construct. And this is an issue because, well, one measure does not a construct made. A measure is just a way of assessing a construct. It's like that stuff about IQ and intelligence, this conundrum about IQ is just one measure of the intelligence construct. And there are basically only two measures right now about psychopathy, which is the PCLR, which is from Hare, and the Psychopathy Personality Inventor, the PPI, which is by Lilienfeld and colleagues. They are the most used. They have the specific characteristics, which is something that I will get into. But there are others like the Levison Self-Report Psychopathy Scale and the Triarch Personality Measure, which is rising on. We don't have much evidence, but it's getting tracks. The PCLR is a measure that is to be administered by a professional. It is very, very focused on criminal samples. So the construct that Hare was trying to focus on was on the criminal psychopath. So he focused on making the measure specific to criminal samples. And this is a benefit, but it is also a drawback of the measure, because it focuses too much on the criminal behaviors, and it excludes the positive adjustment features that psychopathy can have on individuals. And there is a general perspective over the factors. The measure uses two factors: the factor 1, which is for interpersonal and affective aspects, and the factor 2 on the chronic antisocial lifestyle. One thing that is interesting to say is that the factor 1 is very related to the primary psychopath characterizations, and the factor 2 is very tied to the secondary psychopath characterization. And another thing that is very interesting about it is that the measure in general, it is good for assessing criminal behaviors, but not necessarily psychopathy, which is something that is, well, by some people is considered bad, but it has its uses on the specific set of criminal samples, of assessing residents of those type of populations. The Psychopathy Personality Inventor is a self-report scale. It is meant for community samples, so it's meant for not just assessing criminal populations, but also the general community, and it includes positive adjustment. It has two main facets, which are fearless dominance and self-centered impulsivity, and it appeared a third one, which is cold-heartedness. And it's very interesting because when Lillian Field and colleagues they developed this scale, they focus specifically on the community samples. They wanted to know about the cases of successful psychopathy, which is something that people weren't researching because of the measure that Hare did. The PCLR was focused on criminal behaviors, criminal samples, criminal population, and everyone got the gist of, okay, psychopathy is necessarily tied to criminality. And some specific research was trying to tackle this aspect of, is it really? And they developed the PPI just to focus on this aspect of maybe not, and they discovered that there are cases of successful psychopathy, that people who are not engaging in criminal behavior, are not having conflicts with the law, and it's very, very relevant for the biological evidence and findings. When you start to get on the biological aspects, when you get about genes, we get the research about callous and emotional traits, which is mainly focused on children and children with conduct disorder. So it is very interesting because it is irritable. It is a condition that apparently has some contact genes. They are mainly focused on the serotonergic and oxytocinergic genes, and they are moderately irritable. which is something that is interesting because it is very, very influenced by the environment. I will get to it later on, but uh, it is something that is focused on being callous and not emotional. It is something that is focused on the aspect of the affective behaviors that the person has, the autonomic responses the child has, how they learn, and it is something that when people get about genes, they get about the monoaminoxidase gene, which is made away of the low variation of the gene, which was tied to violence and aggressive behavior. And the interesting thing is that it is not related to the SEAL traits. The Mao gene is specific to violent and aggressive behaviors, and the SEAL traits can have antisocial behavior and can have a correlation, but it will be a more environmental aspect, not genetic. And that is something that is interesting because some environmental factors that make the SEAL traits show up more, let me say like that, but make them pop up, are prenatal maternal stress, child maltreatment, disorganized parent-child attachment, and disrupted family functioning. They are very relevant because when we start to talk about treatments, those are the focuses and they work relatively pretty well. When you get about the brain, we get some specific variations about research. We get research about child research, which is child with SEAL traits, and adults that were diagnosed with psychopathy and went for brain imaging studies. And some areas they pop up when we are talking about psychopathy slash SEAL traits, which are amygdala, which is related to avoidance learning, shock reflex, and fear perception, threat perception. We have changes in the orbital frontal cortex. We have changes in insula. We have changes in the anterior cingulate cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. We have changes in the nucleus accumbens and consonate fasciculus. So, making a very, very fast and very, very too long didn't read aspects of it. When we say about amygdala, we are talking about fear, we are talking about avoidance learning, we are talking about startle reflex and autonomic responses in face of threat. When we talk about amygdala, we are perceiving reduced activity in those people. And reduced activity occurs in majority of those areas, like the orbital frontal cortex, which is related to acquired psychopathy, the Phineas gauge that I commented on, which is related to working memory, planning, and has connectivity to the amygdala, to insula, has connectivity to several parts of the brain. And when we talk about insula, we are talking about interoception, about pain, about disgust, and it is also hypoactive, and it has a reduced connection with the anterior cingulate cortex. This is a very specific and particular finding because the insula, as it is related to interoception, proprioception, which is a sense of oneself, of attending to one's internal organs and perceiving my current states. This reduced connection and hypoactivity, they relate to a reduced fear perception in psychopaths. which is very relevant because they sometimes do show fear responses in very specific cases. I will comment on this later on, but they do show fear responses, but the fear perception is probably when you get to ask them, so do you feel something, they will say, I love no. It's like alexithymia, which is a condition that the person cannot tell very well about their own conditions. Like they don't know they are anxious because they can't pay attention to the heartbeat, to their sweating, and stuff like that. The anterior cingulate cortex is related to attention allocation, reward anticipation, and somewhat related to pain perception, and this also has a reduced activity. The nucleus accumbens is related to the reward system and reversal learning, which is a very specific kind of learning that is related to overriding past learning experiences with contextual cues. It's like updating what you learn when you have these present cues. And the interesting thing about it is that they have an hyperactivation of this area. It's the only one that has a very common set of evidence that it hyperactivates. And in my perspective, it relates to them living in the present, let me say like that. Because it's focused on rewards, it is focused on the contextual cues, so they don't take the past in perspective, they don't take the future in perspective with the reduced orbital frontal cortex hypoactivation, and they end up living in the present and it overrides everything else. And the uncinate fasciculus is a structure that connects cortical and subcortical structures, like the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex, and it's generally compromised. I do not like to talk about the aspects of gray matter and white matter findings because the brain is different and the functional aspects are more, in my perspective, more relevant, and the findings over the structural changes are not as stable as the functional ones. So when we talk about the neurocognitive aspects, when you are talking about, well, we focus on the brain, but how does those brain differences, how they appear in reality? So we see three main aspects: emotional responsiveness, reinforcement-based decision-making, and attention. What we have is that emotional responsiveness is disrupted. They have issues with aversive conditioning. They do not learn well when in punishment conditions. And this is a very, very specific finding because these punishment conditions in real life, we do not find very much events in our lives that we have only the punishment, only the aversive going on. While we have the aversive, we have the reinforcer going on too. And the issue of this finding of the reduced aversive conditioning is because they came from real life learning conditions, and we get into a specific set of tasks that they are faced with only the aversive condition without any reinforcement, without any other condition. They do learn, which leads to the issues of the reinforcement based and attention, because what appears to be is that they have an increase in reward and reinforcement learning, they perceive rewards in a much higher perspective than aversives or punishment do. So the aspect of not learning by punishment that the people in the 1900s were talking about, it keeps on, and it's very interesting because they need specific conditions. And when you have the attention aspect, we have the aspect of having hyper-organized dorsal attention network. It's like they have hyper-focus on things. When they are faced with a lot of stuff, they will focus on the good stuff they like, and they will not learn about the aversive conditions. Those findings are very, very relevant, not only for acknowledging that they experience uh, punishment, that they experience emotions, but it's even more important when we start to talk about treatments. And the first line of treatment is to talk about prevention. Prevention is mainly working with children that are in risk for SEAL traits, or they demonstrate they have parents that had it, or they have been screened genetically, or they have been demonstrating the behaviors related to SEAL traits. They fit those characterizations. And the recommended preventive method is parent management training or behavioral parent training, which is basically literally teaching the parents to focus on more positive reinforcement conditions instead of punishments and negative reinforcement. Which this kind of training, it became even more stronger when the findings about those reinforcement based learning and punishment conditions they were bringing up. And that's the importance of having the evidence about the neurocognitive aspects of conditions. We can have specifically tailored interventions to help those people. And that is something that is very hard for these people, especially for adults. I will talk about it next, because adults have been known in research as being untreatable. And we have other types of training, like problem-solving skills training, anger control, contingency management, which is very similar to parent management training, cognitive behavioral interventions, family therapy, and multisystemic therapy. This preventive aspect is very, very relevant, because one thing that I'm trying to make clear is how psychopathy or callous on emotional traits, they are uh, they are genetic, but they change. They change related in relation to the environment the person has. So when you have those parent management training, research on preventive aspects, we have the finding that those children that receive these proper treatment, those specific treatments, they grow up to not have any maladjustments in life. They end up being more organized, they end up being common people in society, they end up studying, not having conflicts with the law, having good families and social relationships. When we talk about adult psychopathy, we talk about a very specific case, because the psychological interventions on adults, they do not have good effects. In fact, they have worsening of the symptoms. When you have come CBT or behavioral therapy being applied, the criminal behaviors, they do not reduce, sometimes they get worse. It is a very specific case of how psychological treatments can cause harm, which is a very interesting perspective that we do not pay attention very much. But psychological interventions can have harm, and that is what happens when we do common or not specific cognitive behavioral or behavioral therapies with those kinds of people. And that is very interesting because there are specific, when those findings about their neurocognitive aspects became, they emerged and became more common as in evidence, there were very specific set of techniques being applied, which are the attention to context. That is a very specific intervention that focuses on teaching how to pay attention to things, how to manage attention. It's like making a attention neuropsychological rehabilitation of attention. And those people benefit from those attention trainings, because when you put those people, those kind of with the psychopathy condition, with training about emotional training, which is affective cognitive control training, which is how to deal with your emotions, how to manage it, how to perceive your conditions. They do not have very good effect, or which leads to the perspective that they have an attentional problem. They have a contingency issue. They are faced with real life conditions that have reinforcers and aversives, and they focus too much on the reinforcers and they do not learn with the aversives. And the attention to context teaches them how to pay attention to these aversives, which is what the right risk personality program in New Zealand is doing. They focus on serial killers and people who have high risk personality. They are people who score very, very high in any kind of assessment of criminal behavior. And they focus on teaching how to pay attention to the relevance of those interactions. So it's very interesting because they start to become tailored specified to the condition. They do not benefit for those general aspects. Medication has few evidence. There were only lithium, phenytoin, and SSRIs for reduction, but only in aggression. It was not for general gains, it was only reduction in aggression, so it's not very relevant in this aspect of having general gains on general behaviors that occur, like criminal behaviors. One perspective that is growing up too is the biofeedback, which is a very specific technique that uses biological markers as feedback for managing the behaviors. So you get the person to use I forgot the name now, but you get the person to use some apparatus that are focused on getting heartbeats, on getting readings on how they are feeling for them, and you use those readings to let them know, hey, you're feeling this, maybe you should change your behavior. And they start to pay attention to those readings, and they start to tie those readings with their own perspectives and feelings about things, and they start to get some good work. They get some good effects by those kind of trainings. So that is something. It's because of this kind of research that I did that I am a believer of the importance of the neurocognitive research and evidence for tailoring the treatments to specific cases and specific conditions, because it's not a one size fits all, and there are specific sets of conditions that benefit from some treatments and not for others, and it's the mechanistic research, the discussion that we have very commonly in this server. Something that that I like to think about is that they are people. They are a subset of people. It's like having a neurodevelopmental disorder. My perspective is that it is the neurodevelopmental disorder. So it influences in the quality of life. They do not have a great life just because they have a very high risk for antisocial behaviors. Reminding, antisocial behaviors is having issues with social rules or with socially accepted behaviors. Some people who have SEAL traits, they will not necessarily engage in criminal behavior or violent behavior, but they will have poor relationships, and those poor relationships will lead to drug abuse. They will lead to poor relationship later on, which can lead to criminality, difficulties, to sexual behaviors, to not ideal sexual behaviors. So it is a thing that it is a group of risk. That's how I perceive this. With proper treatment, if we focus on treating children with positive reinforcement most of the time, if we treat them, focus on reinforcement, not on some punishment or aversive conditions like spanking and emotional abuse or neglect, if we have a proper family setting that focuses on organized parent-child attachment, there is a good parent-child relationship, that the parents are warm, they're responsive, they engage in problem-solving skills, they engage into let's do things, focusing on how to make things better instead of you are just wrong, let's do the right things. They can lead a good life, they can have quality of life. And what demonstrates those things, I commented some things about the being risk of. There is a good representation of how psychopathy is hard. The antisocial personality disorder population, 4% numbers of ASPD, but they are in community. They compose community. They are not necessarily in prison, but they can be those people that are making risky behaviors, risk sexual behaviors. Those people that do not have employment, they lack social emotional skills, and they have prevalence, for example, of some more health conditions like diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and even neurological disorders that are associated like ADHD, anxiety, and even depression. And that is something that is very interesting for me, because People assume psychopathy is not having emotions, but actually is having reduced perception of emotion. And indeed, there is a reduced perception of threats, for example, like the amygdala findings, but it does not mean that they are emotion free, which is one of the evidence for me, in my perspective, about the emotions being complex and constructed things. We have the autonomic responses, but if we do not make sense of those autonomic responses, like people with alexithymia do not, like people with callous and emotional traits do not, like people with schizophrenia do not, they will miss those autonomic responses and they will miss those cues, those bodily cues for managing behavior. They will just plain ignore it and they will not update their behaviors to more contextual cues and engage into more aversive learning and some kind of uh, aspects that emotions are very relevant, like in social relationships. And some things that I wanted to make clear too is that ASPD and callous and emotional traits, they are not just flowers. I'm not advocating that it is, oh, it's everything fine. What I want to make clear is that ASPD is not mentioned in the health research funding, it's not mentioned in the National Institute of Mental Health, and it has a lot of issues in society. It is a public health problem, and that's the importance of research and in public health of managing those cases. Most of those cases they are manageable, specifically talking about the callous and emotional traits, and also goes for the precursors for ASPD or conduct disorder that are related not necessarily to those biological causes, but related to child neglect, abuse, and sexual harm that are done with those kids, and they end up not just with ASPD, they end up with other mental health issues like depression and bipolar disorder, and it is a very relevant issue that I think that I think should have more perspective in research as in focus on public health. And another thing that I want to make clear is that the victims of psychopathic people that engage in criminal and violent behavior, they suffer a lot. And that's very, very relevant because when psychopathic people or people with callous and emotional traits, when they end up in criminal behavior, when they end up with engaging in behaviors that fit the antisocial personality disorder, they are they fit the label of being untreatable, they fit the label of being the worst people because they do not have the aspects of learning by fear, of learning by disgust, of learning by those emotions. So they engage in instrumental aggression, which is aggression by objectives, and engage in reactive aggression, which is aggression, let me say like that, in the heat of the moment. And when they are violent, they are very, very violent. And there is a very sad specific of research that their victims, they are not random. They have facilitated identification of potential victims. It's very interesting research, and it makes for me it makes clear that it is a very, very relevant public health problem because different from those secondary psychopaths or people who are created to be violent or to engaging in criminal behavior, they they have very specific set of conditions that make them even worse. And it's not those, when they engage in criminal behavior, they are not making just behaviors of opportunity, like occurs very commonly. They actively engage. They know what they are doing. It's like they must Nissan delire or the moral insanity. They know what they are doing, and they make their victims. They choose them. They know how to do it, at least by evidence in research. And there is the aftermath in Surviving Psychopathy Foundation, which has helped plenty of people who have been victims of those. It's very specific set of people that has this condition. In general, that's it. I have a reference for everything, but I have selected a specific references for some specific things, like successful psychopathy and general findings that were like very recent, like psychopathy with the brittle, which is from last year, which is very recent, and on callous on emotional traits, which is a very specific set of research, and on treatments, because I think that is very relevant. The government site of Department of Corrections of New Zealand is very nice. It has plenty of research. Their program has a lot of evidence. It is one of the is unique in the world, if I would say it that way. And I posted on the victims because I know it is a very specific thing and people might be interested in reading, whoa, does it really happen? I think that I'm finished. That's it for now. I don't know how much time I spent talking, but I think we are open to questions. I saw some questions in the presentation then. I will answer them later on. But if people are going to stay, I know now that it lasts a lot more than I expected at least. But if people are going to stay and engage in conversation for the Q&A, I'm open, as it is more interactive and it's more it's nicer to do.
Sure, we can definitely move on into the Q&A session. I noticed some people have left some questions in the Presentation Den channel. Unfortunately, some of the people that asked questions had to leave, so I'll go ahead and read out their questions for you to answer, and we'll go in order. If anyone in the channel has any extra questions, please either post them in the Presentation Den channel, or you can also note that you'd like to ask your question through our microphone instead, and I'll unmute you as soon as your turn comes up. BK, does that sound good?
Yes, it's fine.
Perfect. So it looks like our first question is, if a fear can be developed among an individual with psychopathy, do you think they would be more or less responsive to fear extinction tasks?
So this is a very specific question, and I think it's very nice because Rosa studies fear extinction, and I think they will be less responsive. I'm saying this because their focus is not on fear. Their learning, their aversive learning, their avoidance learning is not very good. They do not, specifically when faced with reinforcers, as I commented earlier on. So I think for treatment, the focus will be on reinforcers, not on fear extinction, because those people, they do not, at least in research, they do not suffer from fear-related conditions like PTSD or have, in fact it's the opposite, they have very very risky behaviors, because in real life you don't have the specific aversive, strong aversive. I think we can go to the next question.
Perfect. Just wanted to make sure that you got all your thoughts out on that question. Our next one is, are there any longitudinal studies of long-term outcomes of children with conduct disorder who have had successful behavioral interventions as children?
Yes, we have. It is very very interesting because of that. That's why I said that prevention, for me, in my perspective, and not only my perspective but by evidence, there are good, very very good interventions. They were done with parent management training or behavior management training, where you teach the parents how to properly make contingencies for these children. In this case, for children with callous and emotional traits. And they are longitudinal studies. They went like 6 years later from the intervention, as if I remember correctly. And it's very very interesting because that's why this is the recommended type of treatment of training you have to do with parents. I think we can add to the next one.
Great, thank you. Do you think this relative, quote, common CBT, quote, inefficacy for psychopathic cases has implications for other conditions as well? Maybe having a specific focused treatment plan has benefits for every case.
I think that definitely, because it's like the Husa discussion we were having with Husa, with his research of OCD and PTSD. Uh, CBT, when focused on uh, ERP, in those cases for fear extinction tasks, are golden. They beat exposure and graduated exposure conditions. And that's what happened in those psychopathic cases. It is demonstrating that they have deficits, but they also have some superavits. And in this case, we focus on the superavits. We focus on the strength of reinforce the strength that reinforcers have for them. So when we focus on their rotational problems and we focus on their strong reward system, let me put it that way, we get a very very good treatment, which is basically what the parent management treatment does. It teaches the parents to, okay, now you know how to make good conditions, good contingencies for your children. These contingencies are focused on positive reinforcement. They are focused on, you do this right, you get this good thing you want. You do this wrong, we are going to teach you another alternative response for getting what you want. That's why the problem solving skills training makes part of it. That's why the contingency management uh, appears as treatment, because they are focused on this specific set of, uh, of neurocognitive aspects that psychopaths have. I think you can go to the next.
Fantastic. Our next question is going to be, is there any relationship between conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder / ADHD?
Yes, there are. The evidence is kind of convoluted, but there is evidence of relationship of conduct disorder with ADHD. With oppositional defiant disorder, I cannot say, because there isn't much on these aspects, but on conduct disorder, the ADHD, there is. we don't know, at least in evidence, there isn't much on why or how, but there are plenty of cases that they are concomitant, they occur in relation, and as the last comment that the last pages on the presentation, that conduct disorder, if those people end up having issues, they will end up like having ADHD. It's very related, and probably very related because of the attention issue they have on their selective attention of reaching an attention bottleneck, that they cannot pay attention to a lot of things and they focus too much on the reward. So it is like having a very specific set of ADHD. If I'm extrapolating now, but my perspective is that they have a very specific set of ADHD. The presentation is very similar, but they have this specific condition of being very reward driven and not being punished, and having lower autonomic responses. They do not have much anxiety, they do not have much fear, so it does not play a big role in ADHD usual presentations of ADHD, which are related to anxiety. Get to the next one.
Thank you for that perspective. Our next question is going to be, why do you think age is a factor for why behavioral interventions are effective or not?
So I think it's because of the repertoire that is built. Because I have done work with criminal population, and even people, most people that I work with when those criminal populations, they weren't psychopaths. They were just people who had criminal behaviors. They were caught by the law, and were making their reintegration and rehabilitation of them to integrate in society. And in my personal experience and in evidence, what happens is those people, they learn the language of violence. Let me put it like that. Let me be more artistic, because they learn that they can get things. They learn that they do not need to work for things. They learn that they do not need to take the long road for things. They have learned all their lives that they can just plainly take it up from someone, rob someone, steal from someone, and beat someone and rob them. And that's the life they were faced with. And some neurocognitive findings that suggest this kind of issue is that uh, the successful psychopaths, they have lower, they have they engage more in the areas related to executive functioning, which is basically the prefrontal cortex, and they have more autonomic response. It's not baseline, let me put it, like common people, or the baseline that we find in usual conditions for humans, but it is a little bit more autonomic responses than the unsuccessful cases. And that is very, very interesting, because there may be some, not on age factors, but also some inherent biological factors that make them uh, ha- quoting harder to treat. So I don't know if I answered specifically, but in my perspective, if I were to pinpoint on the age factor, it's because they start, they do not engage in those brain areas related to planning, to holding up and perceiving, of making those receiving feedback from the autonomic system of their own conditions, bodily conditions. We can go to the next one.
All right, our next question is, how does the high prevalence of anxiety among individuals with psychopathy mesh with reduced threat detection and reduced response to aversive conditioning? It seems like there would be nothing to maintain that anxiety.
So that is something interesting because there is a part of the research that is focused on high anxiety and low anxiety uh, subtypes, let me put it like that. And those subtypes of psychopathy, they are related to this anxiety as of more uh, reception of the autonomic systems, of those autonomic systems. So they feel things more. When they are faced with a threat, their bodily reaction is higher, it's stronger. So it is a very interesting thing because that's why I enjoy the insula finding, because insula is very related to the proprioception of perceiving oneself, of perceiving the body of oneself. And if the insula is not uh, well connected to the amygdala, or it is hypoactive, they will have a reduced perception of things. And that is the finding that I find, that is a finding that I think is interesting, because there is a paper focused specifically on the fear aspect of psychopathy. And the finding demonstrate that they have autonomic reactions. They are not devoid of start reflex, of galvanic responses. They do experience it in their bodies. But when you have them at making, when you ask them about, hey, did you feel it? How intense was it? Their fear perception is way lower than you would expect. And this reduced fear perception is probably related to the the poor connection with the insula with the anterior cingulate cortex. So it is a proposition that I'm doing. It's probably with the knowledge about those areas, about the insula, the ACC, about the amygdala. It is what you would expect why it happens. The reduced response to obsessive conditioning, it is a very specific thing, but this reduced response, it happens on real life examples. It happens on when they are faced with reinforcement and aversive cues. So it's like they focus too much on the reinforcement that they just disregard any threats and any aversives that show up. So this reduced response to aversive conditioning is specifically tailored to these conditions, because then when they are faced with specifically the condition of aversive and punishment, they do learn. They can learn. It is not that they are impervious to aversive conditioning in all conditions. They are not like, it's not like they do not have the capacity of learning from punishments, or aversive learning, or like avoidance learning, and those similar conceptualizations of it. I think you can get to the next one. I think I answered it.
Perfect. This may or may not be our last question. If anyone listening has any lingering questions, please post them in the channel before we wrap up after this one. So our last question is, are there any SCRDF treatments for conduct disorder?
Okay, thanks, Ender. If there are any single case research designs of treatments for conduct disorder, as far as I know, no. The cases that research papers that I got, they focus more on randomized trials, they focus on longitudinal aspects, and they do not focus on specific single cases. They have and more than one. So I can try to find it, but they the research that I read on callous and emotional traits that is specific and conduct disorder, these specific sets of conduct disorder cases, I do not. At least I don't know if there are.
All right, thank you, BK. We'll give it a few more moments to see if anyone else has any lingering questions that they'd like to post in the chat. But otherwise, I think that's all the questions we had for tonight. Yep, I don't see anyone typing in the channel, so I think we're good. Thank you, BK, so much for your great presentation in that Q&A session, which was very informative.
Thank you all for coming. My voice is just it's I'm not having my voice at this end, but I think it was very nice to finally speak up for it. It was my first thesis, and I think it's a very relevant because people have a lot of misconceptions and media conceptions about it, and I hope people have learned some things. I hope that I did a great presentation in passing information and making things clear about what it is, what it is not, what it encompasses, and how it is relevant to do this research, and how it can be both detrimental to the individual and to the society. It's not let's make it a good thing to have, as popular media does. It has those, it has detriments, it has risks, and it also has risks to other people, not only to oneself, not to the person that has this condition.
All right, I do believe that was our last question for tonight. So thank you again so much, BK, and I think you did an amazing job. I hope your voice recovers soon.
Thanks. Good night to all. I don't know what time it is. Good night, good morning, because we have people from all the time zones.